Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series. My name is Winfield Myers. I'm the Director of Campus Watch and I'll be our host today. Our guest today is William Jacobson. Professor Jacobson is Clinical Professor of Law at Cornell Law School, the founder of the Legal Insurrection website, and president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation. He earned his BA from Hamilton College and a JD from Harvard Law School. Professor Jacobson, welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar. We're very happy to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
Our topic today, as most of you know, is the Middle East Studies Association's impending vote by its full membership on whether or not to make the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction, or BDS, of Israel its official policy. Its members attending its annual conference back last month voted 93% of the 444 who were there to pass this along to the full membership to be voted on. And Professor Jacobson is going to discuss today, among other things, the possible ramifications of this passage if it does pass. The vote seems to be scheduled for sometime this month, so we could only be a week or two away from this vote, and when it occurs, certainly the Middle East Forum, and I'm sure Legal Insurrection will broadcast it and comment on it, however it goes. Professor Jacobson, you had noted earlier and in some of your writings that if this passes from the full membership, that to carry out a boycott against Israeli academics, they may run afoul, in your words, of anti-discrimination and academic freedom protections. What are the implications of this? How do you see this falling out should they vote yes, which would not surprise many people, I don't believe.
Right. Well, I'm not going to go into too much background because I know our time is limited, but the Middle East Studies Association has passed a resolution, and as is often the case, they got their people out to the business meeting. So that is not necessarily a representative sample of the entire membership. So there were 400 some odd people at the business meeting. There were 2,700 voting members. And there have been instances in the past where a resolution makes its way out of the business meeting at a faculty or an association and does not pass the membership. So it's not a given that it will pass, but it probably will, because unlike a lot of the other organizations like American Historical Association, Modern Language Association, there does not seem to be an internal opposition at MESA, because everybody who would be has long left the organization because it's so skewed anti-Israel. So this is going to come up for a vote. And I think MESA is very much aware that it could run into problems because they have worded the resolution very curiously. Okay. The way they've worded it is that be it resolved, and I'm doing this from memory, but I think accurately, that the majority of the membership of MESA endorses the boycott call. And the second operative is that the directors of MESA are directed to implement it consistent with local and federal and state laws and academic freedom. So they know there's going to be a storm coming if this passes, just like there was a storm several years ago. It was December 2013. The American Studies Association passed the boycott resolution, and that was a little stronger language than MESA used. And there was a firestorm of controversy, and there has not been a major academic group since December of 2013 that has passed it. There have been some smaller ones, but none of the major ones. So this would be I consider a major one. And 250 university presidents signed statements opposing the ASA boycott. They faced lawsuits and a lot of backlash. How might it play out here? Well, the first thing is that most university campuses, I'll dare say every single one, has anti-discrimination policies, which are sometimes much broader than federal and state law. They are expansively broad. And I think you can make a very good argument that if the boycott is carried out on campus, and I emphasize that, is carried out. I don't mean somebody having an opinion on it. I don't mean somebody saying, I support it. But if it's actually implemented by MESA through its members on a campus, it arguably is discrimination on the basis of national origin, and it arguably is discrimination on the basis of religion, because let's face it, this is the one majority Jewish state in the world, okay? And so those campus provisions could come into play. I think they would come into play. Whether federal and state protections come into play, it would have to be very fact specific. If you were able to prove that an Israeli was singled out for being an Israeli, or if you were able to prove that a Jewish student who wanted to study in Israel was singled out because of that. And I think there have been instances, and the sort of things where that could come up is, for example, a professor is willing to write a recommendation for a student to attend the University of Amman, but not the University of Tel Aviv. Okay. And that would be implementing a boycott. That would be not only potentially violating the school's anti-discrimination laws, but academic freedom protections that apply to students and faculty. So faculty, where sometimes the line becomes blurry, but the distinction I always draw is you're entitled to believe whatever you want to believe. And frankly, you're entitled to say just about anything you want to say. But when you are on a campus, you have to abide by the campus's rules and regulations. And that's particularly important if you have an administrative role. And if the school has a policy against the boycott of Israel, then you have to abide by that. Either that or get another job, okay? You have to abide by your employer's rules. And so that, I think, is really important to keep in mind. It's the implementation of it that becomes important. And we do know that these things are actually implemented. And so the distinction between speech and conduct becomes extremely, extremely important. The other thing I would say is, as probably most people on this call understand, that you always hear BDS say, BDS is supporters, at least the ones who are honest, say this is just a tactic. BDS is a tactic. And they're right. It is and it took me a while to understand this. They don't actually care if you study at Tel Aviv University. They don't actually care if the dining hall serves sabra hummus. Some of their useful fools who support them may care, but the people behind it actually don't care. They use this as an opportunity to propagandize the campus against Israel. And if they can get a campus to spend 2 months or 3 months in a student council debating how bad Israel is it just bad or is it bad enough to boycott? And they lose the vote. They actually don't care. For them, it is a generational project. It is not a project to pass a resolution, a meaningless resolution at a student government. It is a generational project. And I think the people opposing this and opportunities like Mesa provide an opportunity to get campuses to affirm their support for academic involvement with Israel. We've already obtained, we haven't gone public with it yet, we will, several statements from university presidents rejecting the boycott, not promising to do anything about it, but rejecting the boycott and affirming their intention to interact with Israel. So I think they use this as a tactic. You can also, regardless of whether it violates a particular rule, use this as a chance to educate people. Because again, people on this call understand this is just a new variation on the anti-Jewish boycott that started in the British Mandate for Palestine in the 1920s. Some people would say even earlier, but you can see a clear continuation that this is just the repackaged anti-Jewish boycott to speak to a social justice, younger sort of Western audience. And so I don't know that the answer to this ultimately is the law or anything like that, but there are legal protections that people are entitled to enforce. And I think Mesa, 100% reading their resolution, they see this coming and they're going to say, oh, this is just a resolution expressing an opinion, not actually promising to do anything.
I would note that this kind of activism and anti-Israel activism on the part of Mesa flows directly from the scholarship of its members over many, many decades now. And one of the core elements of that scholarship regarding Israel is the delegitimization of Israel as a Jewish state. So this is just politics by more political means, if you will, not the scholarly, but it flows directly from what they have been teaching and writing for 30 years now and more. So it's not a surprise to those of us who follow this organization. A few years ago, when it was brought up, there was actually a debate, and I think in 2014 at their annual meeting, and a few people got up and spoke against this. Kind of surprising who it was: Juan Cole of the University of Michigan, Nathan Brown of George Washington, a few others. You wouldn't necessarily expect this from, because they're such virulent critics of Israel, but they spoke up against that at that point. If they have spoken up against it now, I haven't heard anything about it. I don't know whether they just have changed their minds or whether they're just so outgunned at this point they figure it's not worth the fight.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a Mesa member. I wasn't in at the business meeting. I've only heard reports of it. And apparently it was an extremely one-sided presentation. There were no real opposition voices. Yeah. So, and that's where the organization has gone.
Yeah, no, it is indeed. Well, you mentioned in some of your writing the possible violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, violating the civil rights of students, of professors. Yeah. What are the consequences of that? I know can be a threat to curtail federal funds to institutions that violate it. That's a draconian move. It's hard to get anybody to do that in Washington for obvious political reasons. But is that a possible reaction to this? Should, let's say, Israeli scholars be banned, not banned in a physical sense perhaps, but not recognized by or not invited to a particular campus, or should, as you said, students be denied the opportunity to study abroad in Israel? I know at the University of Michigan, there was a lecturer a few years ago who infamously refused to write a letter of recommendation for a student wanting to study in Israel. And of course, it exploded in his face, as it should have. Do you see that as a possible consequence?
It's unlikely to happen, as you indicated, but and it's particularly unlikely to happen with the current administration. But maybe if there's another administration in the future, I think the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education, maybe even the Justice Department, I don't know who has jurisdiction over something like that, could certainly open an investigation. And I think that that sort of systemic discrimination should at least be looked into. And if nothing else, that may elicit a more positive response in addressing it from the administrations, because I mean, that is the nuclear bomb for modern university systems, because there probably isn't a one. I mean, there might be one, Hillsdale College, but there aren't many that don't receive federal money.
That's right. That's right. And you've noted too, the institutional memberships of MESA that include, I'm just looking at a list, Columbia, Cornell, your own university, Dartmouth, Duke, UNC, Florida State, George Washington, Georgetown, Harvard, on and on, Indiana U, big schools, NYU, all up and down the list are institutional members of MESA. And of course, many other professors are institutional members. You had noted that one consequence could be, and that maybe this would be easier to pull off, I don't know, the refusal or the denial of the payment of fees or funds to join it either institutionally or individually, should this pass.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to understand how a university, which has a policy of interaction with Israel and a policy of protecting academic freedom, not just of Israelis. Remember, this has to be framed the way it needs to be framed. This is academic freedom for Americans, not just Israelis, okay? Yeah. If a student is deprived, if researchers are deprived, this is actually a threat also to our health. I mean, think of how many medical innovations have come out of Israeli institutes and that cooperation. So I think that, that has to be something that's taken into account, that they need to protect the academic freedom of Americans on their campus, not just of Israelis.
Sure, of course. Yeah, they're in the name of academic freedom, in their words, denying academic freedom. They're saying that they're doing it for the academic freedom of Palestinian scholars, Palestinian students at various universities in the West Bank and elsewhere, and for, I believe the language includes, and for their Israeli counterparts who are persecuted by the Israeli government. So for your own good, we're going to prevent you from having the academic freedom that you had before.
I mean, that is the unique feature of academic BDS. It may be the only movement which claims the academic freedom to deprive others of academic freedom. I mean, that is the whole point. Depriving others of academic freedom is the entire point of academic BDS. I mean, there's a bigger point of delegitimizing Israel, but that is their methodology. And so it's a very curious thing, because the first thing they scream, if anything is done to protect Americans' academic freedom or Israelis, is they scream, well, you're infringing our academic freedom. And of course, you'll get faculty members around the country to form groups and sign petitions and how bad this is. But they want the academic freedom to deprive others of academic freedom. And I don't know of any other instance where that's the case.
Mm-hmm. And done unironically, I would know. We've noted that Governor DeSantis down in Florida has, because Florida State University is one of the institutional members, has spoken out against this. You mentioned university presidents. Do you see the possibility of voters, citizens of other states, particularly for state public universities that are institutional members of MESA, to speak up against this, to petition the legislature, the governors and others to speak out and maybe take action against this should their institutional public universities in their states adopt this?
Well, I think that people tend to forget that the voices on campus include alumni, parents, and the general community. They have a legitimate say. And for the American Studies Association boycott, people started reaching out to university presidents. So actually, they did it through my website. And maybe we'll post that information again, because we've emailed for comment so we can report on it every university president who has an institutional membership. And we've only heard back from a handful of them. And some are no comment, and others are, we stand by the prior statement. We oppose the boycott of Israel. We have not heard back from Florida State University, surprisingly. We have not heard back from the Florida Board of Governors, which governs their universities. But these are all things that people are entitled to get their voices heard. There are petitions practically every week against Israel circulated. I don't know that we need a petition here, but I think at some point, we may publish the public contact information for university officials, particularly those who refuse to respond to us, because I think the community is entitled to know, and a prospective student is entitled to know whether that student's going to be deprived of academic opportunities because MESA is operating on the campus.
That's right. That's right. And I would suggest maybe a lot of organizations to do that, particularly at the state level. Donors, donors, I've thought for decades and decades, we all are alumni, so at some place, and you get these multi-million-dollar PR campaigns aimed at us every year, telling us how wonderful things are on campus, how nostalgic we're made to feel, especially the older we get. And so think back to your 20s when you were young, and this is exactly the way things are, and so give us $10,000 and things will be well. So I've always thought that's a weak link to universities that's rarely exploited, particularly public universities, less so for schools with multi-billion-dollar endowments. But your average public school simply doesn't have that kind of money at hand, and they can be squeezed through grassroots pressure, through organized resistance, if you will, to this kind of manipulation of, as you say, students and their own professors, not just Israelis.
Yeah, and I think it's always very important to make distinctions between the speech of people and the academic freedom. So if I'm against, trying to purge professors, I mean, God knows I've been tried to be purged many times. I'm against that. But that doesn't mean that a professor can actively discriminate in the conduct of running a course. They can go off to a MESA meeting and say whatever they want to say. But once they're conducting a course and once they're conducting school business with school funds, they have to abide by school policies.
Sure. Let me invite our audience to submit questions if you would like. We haven't gotten many yet, but one is from Jay Lewis. He says, are there competing academic organizations to MESA, and are they getting any traction?
There is one competing organization, and forgive me for not remember.
I can tell you it's the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa.
I remember the acronym. I
Yes, I do too.
what it stood for. Yes, ASMEA. Don't ask me to repeat what it stands for. ASMEA, I think, is an alternative.
It is.
Hopefully more people will go there. But there is once you've accumulated an institutional presence, it's hard for an upstart. Now, they're not exactly an upstart, but it's hard for a new organization to establish itself. But that would be good. There was an attempt to create an alternative organization to the American Studies Association, but it's a lot of work. You need donors, you need a staff, you need a presence, and you need somebody who's committed to it for 4 to 6 years, maybe more, to get it launched. And so it's a big undertaking, and MISA has been there for a while. I forget when it was founded, but it's been decades. And, it's going to be hard to displace them. That's just the reality. You can marginalize them. Okay. There's no reason why an organization which endorses the boycott and has its directors have been instructed to carry it out should be able to use university funds, for example, or university facilities.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Again, I'll repeat the name. It's the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. I think it's doing quite well. But as you say, MISA bills itself as the umbrella organization for the field. It's been around since 1966, I believe. It's difficult to replace a large, once venerable scholarly organization, no matter how far they have fallen. Same is true for other scholarly organizations, American Historical Association, American Political Science Association, and so on. Starting these is an arduous task. If there are any donors who want to do that, this is a worthy challenge, I would suggest. Jerry Densis says, is BDS not blatantly anti-scholarly? Should this disqualify faculty as not scholarly?
Well, I think, again, BDS is a very strange thing because it's the academic study of depriving others of academic freedom. So I don't know. I don't think you can, with the broad brush, say it's not scholarly. I don't know what the repercussions of that would be, but it is a political movement. I mean, that's what it is. It's not a scholarly endeavor. It's a political movement, arguably a continuation of the anti-Jewish boycotts, but was birthed at and there's a lot of misinformation out there, but it was actually birthed at the 2001 Durban conference. And then they created this superficial window dressing that it was actually a 2005 call from Palestinian civil society, but that's actually not true. The entire formulation of the boycott was a Durban formulation in the declaration of the NGO forum at Durban, and it began to be carried out before 2005. So they were already boycotting Israel under a BDS style formula before the so-called Palestinian call from civil society. And nobody ever seems to indicate who was that civil society. Well, it was all the same groups that supported the boycott to begin with. So it's not a scholarly endeavor, but I'm not sure you can declare the entire field as not worthy of being taught or spoken about on campus because of that. It's a political movement.
Sure. Julia Lutch writes, why does it seem so easy for groups hostile to Israel to get the funding and long-term backing they need?
Yeah, I mean, follow the money. They never seem to be at a loss for funds. Now, a lot of these academic organizations don't necessarily get outside infusions of cash. They get membership dues, and those membership dues are almost always paid by universities. Most faculty, I can't say all, have certain expenses they are legitimately able to put through on the university, or they might have a budget for that. I know we do at Cornell, we've got a certain research fund, and as long as it's an appropriate thing, you can use it for those purposes. So the university ends up paying it. So basically, universities, and not just the member universities, but universities are funding these groups, at least indirectly. They also have sponsors. They have publishing deals. You can go to the MISA website and look at who all their sponsors are and who they have agreements with. So they don't necessarily receive a big check from a donor. They don't need to. They are pretty much self-funding.
Sure. Stuart Broad notes, and I meant to mention this a moment ago, he's exactly right. There's another fine organization, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, in addition to the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. Both somewhat alternatives, again, founded as alternatives to MISA, given its long time politicization. Eric asks, do you think CARE or other Palestinian or Muslim organizations are behind this, and how can we fight this?
Well, behind it, I'm not sure if that's the right term, but there definitely is a lot of crossover. So we've written a lot about connector groups. So American Muslims for Palestine is one of these connector groups that connects various anti-Israel groups. Where everybody gets their funding, I don't know, but you cannot view the BDS groups in isolation. They are not in isolation. They're part of a greater ecosystem that seems to have a lot of money, and one of their targets is Israel. And this is just the way they do it.
Sure. I can tell you too that a lot of professors who are members and even past presidents of MISA, like John Esposito, for example, at Georgetown, have spoken at CARE banquets more than once. The connection may or may not be formal. I don't know about that. It probably is in times. Yes, there are some, and I could name some names on that too, that do have formal connections. Funding is a different question, as you say. That's not exactly the same thing as being associated with CARE in some ways, but the associations and the friendliness is certainly there. A few years ago, MISA also had a table at their annual conference from the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which undoubtedly has Islamist ties and funding, and so thereby trying to legitimize them, failing ultimately, of course, to do that too. Stephen Orlow says, how does one organize a campaign against MISA, revisiting something we discussed earlier, MISA anti-BDS efforts? Is there access to their membership list? The final question I can say, no, I don't think there's an access to their membership list that I know of.
But their institutional members are listed right on their website. Yes. And you certainly could reach out. And I always say, people, please be polite, okay? But you can reach out expressing concern that whether university funds are going to be used to support this boycott effort. I mean, I think that's appropriate. And those universities are listed there. They are directly paying dues to MISA, and they are probably in a perhaps a less direct way supporting it. And I think if that's what they want to do, they should announce it. Okay, they should take a position on it. And if their position is they support the boycott of Israel, we'll deal with that, and they'll deal with that. But if their position is against it, then they've got to address why they're a member of an organization which has endorsed it, and is not just endorsed it, but vowed, instructed their board of directors to carry it out.
Sure. Robert Larrick asks, how do these academics feel about the Hezbollah rejectionist terrorist takeover and the destruction of Lebanon, the old Paris of the Middle East, now in ruins? Let me just note quickly, I would say a lot of the professors that we follow daily, one of the hallmarks of their scholarship, such as it is, and their teaching, is that many of them ignore the systemic problems in the Middle East, whether it's terrorism or the mistreatment of women or the expanding Iranian hegemony throughout the region through Hezbollah and other organizations. Not a lot of attention paid to that, but do you have a comment on that also?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I encounter often, that people can't understand why these people are the way they are, okay? And well, don't they want to be balanced? Don't they want to be, take all? And the answer is no, they don't want to be balanced. That's not what this is about. This is not a scholarly endeavor. This is not a seeking of the truth. I mean, this is just war against Israel by another means. And there are honest ones who will admit that. But most of the people who participate in the US and Western Europe are really, I think the term the Soviets used to use is useful idiots. I mean, they believe the propaganda angle. They believe they're doing something for social justice, and they don't really care what Hezbollah is doing in Lebanon. They just want to rid the world of the Zionist entity.
That's right.
And I will say also, we've talked a little about the Islamist connections. Let me tell you something. You go to any university, who's going to be front and center? It's far left-wing Jews, anti-Zionist Jews. Okay, they are the driving force behind this in the university setting. And the second an issue is raised that this is discriminatory against Israelis or against Jews, who's going to, if you follow, as we've done for many years, the campus boycotts at student councils, who is always the first speaker in favor of the resolution? Someone from the local chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. Okay, they do that deliberately. They use those people as a shield against correct accusations of anti-Semitism. So, we don't focus really. I mean, I think the ties to Islamist organizations, that's all interesting. But on practical terms, in the United States, the driving force are anti-Zionist left-wing Jews.
Interesting. We're coming to the end of the webinar. If people want to learn more about you and about your organization, tell us where they can find you.
Sure. Well, the main website is legalinsurrection.com. Legal Insurrection Foundation, which is a 501c3, is our operating entity, and it has its own website. And we have recently as in early last year, a secondary website called criticalrace.org, where we track all that's going on the campuses about critical race theory and its offshoots. Or you can Google me, and you'll find some very interesting stuff.
Indeed, and a lot of your writing, you're a prolific writer. So, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate this. This has been most informative. I think our audience has benefited from it. I hope so. And I would ask the audience to please be on the lookout for future emails, including one this weekend announcing our future webinars. So again, we've been with Professor William Jacobson of Cornell and Legal Insurrection. Again, thank you so much. This has been an excellent session. We appreciate it very much.
Great.
To our audience, thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.